Social Science. Our Pasts 1, 2 and 3. Textbook in History for Class 6, 7 and 8. Foreword. The National Curriculum Framework, NCF, 2005 recommends that children's life at school must be linked to their life outside the school. This principle marks a departure from the legacy of bookish learning which continues to shape our system and causes a gap between the school, home, and community. The syllabi and textbooks developed on the basis of NCF signify an attempt to implement this basic idea. They also attempt to discourage rote learning and the maintenance of sharp boundaries between different subject areas. We hope these measures will take us significantly further in the direction of a child-centered system of education outlined in the National Policy on Education, 1986. The success of this effort depends on the steps that school principals and teachers will take to encourage children to reflect on their own learning and to pursue imaginative activities and questions. We must recognize that, given space, time and freedom, children generate new knowledge by engaging with the information passed on to them by adults. Treating the prescribed textbook as the sole basis of examination is one of the key reasons why other resources and sites of learning are ignored. Inculcating creativity and initiative is possible if we perceive and treat children as participants in learning, not as receivers of a fixed body of knowledge. These aims imply considerable change in school routines and mode of functioning. Flexibility in the daily timetable is as necessary as rigor in implementing the annual calendars so that the required number of teaching days are actually devoted to teaching. The methods used for teaching and evaluation will also determine how effective this textbook proves to be for making children's life at school a happy experience, rather than a source of stress or boredom. Syllabus designers have tried to address the problem of curricular burden by restructuring and reorienting knowledge at different stages with greater consideration for child psychology and the time available for teaching. The textbook attempts to enhance this endeavor by giving higher priority and space to opportunities for contemplation and wondering, discussion in small groups, and activities requiring hands-on experience. The National Council of Educational Research and Training, NCERT, appreciates the hard work done by the Textbook Development Committee responsible for this book. We wish to thank the chairperson of the advisory group in social science, Professor Harry Vasudevan, and the chief advisor for this book, Professor Neil Adri Bhattacharya, for guiding the work of this committee. Several teachers contributed to the development of this textbook. We are grateful to their principals for making this possible. We are indebted to the institutions and organizations, which have generously permitted us to draw upon their resources, material, and personnel. We are especially grateful to the members of the National Monitoring Committee, appointed by the Department of Secondary and Higher Education, Ministry of Human Resource Development under the chairpersonship of Professor Mrinal Miri and Professor G. P. Deshpande, for their valuable time and contribution. As an organization committed to systemic reform and continuous improvement in the quality of its products, NCERT welcomes comments and suggestions which will enable us to undertake further revision and refinement. Director, National Council of Educational Research and Training. Why study history? This year, in Class 6, you will read history. It is part of a bigger group of subjects known as social science. Social science helps us understand the working of our social world. It tells us about geography, the way the economy works, and the manner in which social and political life is organized. Most parts of social science other than history tell you about the world in the present. History will help you understand how this present evolved. It will tell you about the past of the present. When we live in a society, we become used to the world around us. We begin to take that world for granted. We forget that life was not always the way we see it. Can you, for instance, imagine a life without fire? Can you think of what it is to live in a society where the cultivation of crops was unknown? Or, what it was to live at a time when roads and railways did not exist, and yet people traveled long distances? History can take us into these pasts. History in this sense is an adventure. It is a journey across time and space. It transports us into another world, another age, in which people lived differently. Their economy and society, their beliefs and faiths, their clothes and food, their settlements and buildings, their arts and crafts, everything was different. History can open doors into such worlds. You may shrug your shoulders and say, why should we bother about pasts that are no longer with us, pasts that have gone by? But history is not just about the past. It is about the present. The society we live in has been fashioned by those who came before us. The joys and sorrows of their daily lives, their attempt to grapple with the problems of their time, their discoveries and inventions, slowly transformed human societies. These changes were often so gradual, so seemingly small, that their impact was not noticed by people at that time. Only later, when we return to the past, when we study history, can we begin to see how these changes happened, and we can observe their long-term effect. By reading history we can understand how the modern world has emerged over long centuries of development. The book that you will study this year will take you back to our ancient pasts. Over the next 2 years you will continue your journey through the history of subsequent periods. In this book you will read not just about the kings and queens who lived in ancient India, and about their conquests and policies. You will learn about hunters and peasants, craftspeople and traders. You will see how fire came to be used, and iron tools were discovered, how wheat and rice began to be cultivated, and villages and towns developed. You will read about pilgrims and saints, buildings and paintings, religions and beliefs. You will find out that history is not only about great men. It is also about the lives and activities of ordinary women, men, and children. History is not only about political events, it is about everything that happens in society. The book will also help you understand how historians come to know about the past. Somewhat like detectives, historians follow clues and traces left by people who lived in the past. Everything that survives from earlier times: stone tools, traces of plants, bones, written material and pictures, ornaments and implements, inscriptions and coins, buildings and sculpture, pots and pans can tell us something about the past. Historians and archaeologists study these sources and try and understand them. In this book, you will see many of these sources and find out how historians study these. But studying history can help us understand more than the past. It enables us to develop important skills and qualities. When we try and enter another world, we have to learn how to do this. To understand people whose lives were different. As we do this, we open up our minds and break out of our small present-day worlds. We begin to see how other people may think and act. This can become a learning experience that enriches us in many different ways. So, before you shrug your shoulders, ask yourself one question: do I want to know who I am? Do I want to understand how this society works? Do I want to understand the world in which I live? If you do, then you will need to know how our societies have evolved, and how our pasts have shaped the present. Neeladri Bhattacharya, Chief Advisor. History. Contents. Foreword. Why study history? 1. What, where, how and when. 2. On the trail of the earliest people. 3. From gathering to growing food. 4. In the earliest cities. 5. What books and burials tell us? 6. Kingdoms, kings, and an early republic. 7. New questions and ideas. 8. Ashoka, the emperor who gave up war. 9. Vital villages, thriving towns. 10. Traders, kings, and pilgrims. 11. New empires and kingdoms. 12. Buildings, paintings, and books. Chapter 1. What, where, how and when. Rashida's question. Rashida sat reading the newspaper. Suddenly, her eyes fell on a small headline. 100 years ago. Happened so many years ago? How, she wondered, could anyone know what had? Finding out what happened. Yesterday, you could listen to the radio, watch television, read a newspaper. Last year, Ask somebody who remembers. But what about long, long ago? Let us see how it can be done. What can we know about the past? There are several things we can find out: what people ate, the kinds of clothes they wore, the houses in which they lived. We can find out about the lives of hunters, herders, farmers, rulers, merchants, priests, craftspersons, artists, musicians, and scientists. We can also find out about the games children played, the stories they heard, the plays they saw, the songs they sang. Where did people live? Find the river Narmada on map 1. People have lived along the banks of this river for several 100,000 years. Some of the earliest people who lived here were skilled gatherers, that is, people who gathered their food. They knew about the vast wealth of plants in the surrounding forests, and collected roots, fruits, and other forest produce for their food. They also hunted animals. Now find the Sulayman and Kurdhar hills to the northwest. Some of the areas where women and men first began to grow crops such as wheat and barley about 8,000 years ago are located here. People also began rearing animals like sheep, goat, and cattle, and lived in villages. Locate the Garo hills to the northeast and the Vindhyas in central India. These were some of the other areas where agriculture developed. The places where rice was first grown are to the north of the Vindhyas. Trace the river Indus and its tributaries. Tributaries are smaller rivers that flow into a larger river. About 4,700 years ago, some of the earliest cities flourished on the banks of these rivers. Later, about 2,500 years ago, cities developed on the banks of the Ganga and its tributaries, and along the seacoasts. Locate the Ganga and its tributary called the Sun. In ancient times the area along these rivers to the south of the Ganga was known as Magadha. Its rulers were very powerful, and set up a large kingdom. Kingdoms were set up in other parts of the country as well. Throughout, people traveled from one part of the subcontinent to another. The hills and high mountains including the Himalayas, deserts, rivers, and dangerous at times, but never impossible. So, men and women, seas made journeys moved in search of livelihood, as also to escape from natural disasters like floods or droughts. Sometimes, men marched in armies, conquering others' lands. Besides, merchants traveled with caravans or ships, carrying valuable goods from place to place. And religious teachers walked from village to village, town to town, stopping to offer instruction and advice on the way. Finally, some people perhaps traveled driven by a spirit of adventure, wanting to discover new and exciting places. All these led to the sharing of ideas between people. Why do people travel nowadays? Look at map 1 once more. Hills, mountains, and seas form the natural frontiers of the subcontinent. While it was difficult to cross these frontiers, those who wanted could and did scale the mountains and cross the seas. People from across the frontiers also came into the subcontinent and settled here. These movements of people enriched our cultural traditions. People have shared new ways of carving stone, composing music, and even cooking food over several hundreds of years. Names of the land. Two of the words we often use for our country are India and Bharat. The word India comes from the Indus, called Sindhu in Sanskrit. Find Iran and Greece in your atlas. The Iranians and the Greeks who came through the northwest about 2,500 years ago and were familiar with the Indus, called it the Hindos or the Indos, and the land to the east of the river was called India. The name Bharata was used for a group of people who lived in the northwest, and who are mentioned in the Rigveda, the earliest composition in Sanskrit, dated to about 3,500 years ago. Later it was used for the country. Finding out about the past. There are several ways of finding out about the past. One is to search for and read books that were written long ago. These are called manuscripts, because hand, this comes from the Latin word manu, meaning hand. Written on palm leaf, or on the specially prepared bark of a tree which grows in the Himalayas. Hay were written by these were usually known as the birch. Over the years, many manuscripts were eaten away by insects, some were destroyed, but many have survived, often preserved in temples and monasteries. These books dealt with all kinds of subjects, religious beliefs and practices, the lives of kings, medicine, and science. Besides, there were epics, poems, plays. Many of these were written in Sanskrit, others were in Prakrit, languages used by ordinary people, and Tamil. We can also study inscriptions. These are writings on relatively hard surfaces such as stone or metal. Sometimes, kings got their orders inscribed so that people could see, read, and obey them. There are other kinds of inscriptions as well, where men and women, including kings and queens, recorded what they did. For example, kings often kept records of victories in battle. Can you think of the advantages of writing on a hard surface? And what could have been the difficulties? There were many other things that were made and used in the past. Those who study these objects are called archaeologists. They study the remains of buildings made of stone and brick, paintings, and sculpture. They also explore and excavate, dig under the surface of the earth, to find tools, weapons, pots, pans, ornaments and coins. Some of these objects may be made of stone, others of bone, baked clay, or metal. Objects that are made of substances usually survive for a long time. Archaeologists also look for bones of animals, birds, and fish. Hard, imperishable. To find out what people ate in the past. Plant remains survive far more rarely if seeds of grain or pieces of wood have been burnt, they survive in a charred form. Do you think cloth is found frequently by archaeologists? Historians, that is, scholars who study the past, often use the word source to refer to the information found from manuscripts, inscriptions, and archaeology. Once sources are found, learning about the past becomes an adventure, as we reconstruct it bit by bit. So historians and archaeologists are like detectives, who use all these sources like clues to find out about our pasts. One past or many? Did you notice the title of this book, Our Pasts? We have used the word pasts in plural to draw attention to the fact that the past was different for different groups of people. For example, the lives of herders or farmers were different from those of kings and queens, the lives of merchants were different from those of craftspersons, and so on. Also, as is true even today, people followed different practices and customs in different parts of the country. For example, today most people living in the Andaman Islands get their own food by fishing, hunting, and collecting forest produce. By contrast, most people living in cities depend on others for supplies of food. Differences such as these existed in the past as well. Besides, there is another kind of difference. We know a great deal about kings and the battles they fought because they kept records of their victories. Generally, ordinary people such as hunters, fishing folk, gatherers, farmers, or herders did not keep records of what they did. While archaeology helps us to find out about their lives, there is much that remains unknown. What do dates mean? If somebody asks you the date, you will probably mention the day, month, and year, 2000 and something. These years are counted from the date generally assigned to the birth of Jesus Christ, the founder of Christianity. So, 2000 means 2000 years after the birth of Christ. All dates before the birth of Christ are counted backwards and usually have the letters BC, before Christ, added on. In this book, we will refer to dates going back from the present, using 2000 as our starting point. Elsewhere, we have seen that inscriptions are written on hard surfaces. Many of these were written several hundreds of years ago. All inscriptions contain both scripts and languages. Languages which were used, as well as scripts, have changed over time. So how do scholars understand what was written? This can be done through a process known as decipherment. One of the most famous stories of decipherment comes from Egypt, a country in North Africa where there were kings and queens about 5,000 years ago. Rosetta is a town on the north coast of Egypt, and here an inscribed S1 was found, which contained inscriptions in 3 different languages and scripts, Greek, and 2 forms of Egyptian. Scholars who could read Greek figured out that the names of kings and queens were enclosed in a little frame, called a cartouche. They then placed the Greek and the Egyptian signs side by side, and identified the sounds for which the Egyptian letters stood. As you can see, a lion stood for L, and a bird for A. Once they knew what the letters stood for, they could read other inscriptions as well. Chapter 2. On the Trail of the Earliest People. Tushar's Train Journey. Tushar was going from Delhi to Jinnah for his cousin's wedding. They were traveling by train and he had managed to squeeze into the window seat, his nose glued to the glass pane. As he watched trees and houses fly past, his uncle tapped his shoulder and said, "Do you know that trains were first used about 150 years ago, and that people began using buses a few decades later?" Tushar wondered, when people could not travel quickly from one place to another, did they spend their entire lives wherever they were born? Not quite. The earliest people, why were they on the move? We know about people who lived in the subcontinent as early as 2 million years ago. Today, we describe them as hunter-gatherers. The name comes from the way in which they got their food. Generally, they hunted wild animals, caught fish and birds, gathered fruits, roots, nuts, seeds, leaves, stalks and eggs. The immense variety of plants in a tropical land like ours meant that gathering plant produce was a means of obtaining food. Extremely important. None of these things was easy to do. There are several animals that run faster than us, many that are stronger. To hunt animals or catch fish and birds, people need to be alert, quick, and have lots of presence of mind. To collect plant produce, you need to find out which plants or parts of plants are edible, that is, can be eaten, as many can be poisonous. You also need to find out about the seasons when the fruits ripen. List the skills and knowledge that the children of these communities had. Do you have these skills and knowledge? There are at least hunter-gatherers moved from place to place. 4 reasons why. First, if they had stayed at one place for a long time, they would have eaten up all the available plant and animal resources. Therefore, they would have had to go elsewhere in search of food. Second, animals move from place to place either in search of smaller prey, or, in the case of deer and wild cattle, in search of grass and leaves. That is why those who hunted them had to follow their movements. Third, plants and trees bear fruit in different seasons. So, people may have moved from season to season in search of different kinds of plants. Fourth, people, plants and animals need water to survive. Water is found in lakes, streams, and rivers. While many rivers and lakes are perennial, with water throughout the year, others are seasonal. People living on their banks would have had to go in search of water during the dry seasons, winter and summer. Besides, people may have traveled to meet their friends and relatives. Remember, they traveled on foot. How do you come to school? How long would it take you to walk from your home to school? How long would it take you if you took a bus or rode a bicycle? How do we know about these people? Archaeologists have found some of the things hunter-gatherers made and used. It is likely that people made and used survived best. Tools of stone, wood, and bone, of which stone tools have. Some uses of stone tools are given below. Make a list of what these tools were used for and try and decide which of these tasks could be performed using a natural pebble. Give reasons for your answer. Some of these stone tools were used to cut meat and bone, scrape bark from trees and hides, animal skins, chop fruit and roots. Some may have been attached to handles of bone or wood, to make spears and arrows for hunting. Other tools were used to chop wood, which was used as firewood. Wood was also used to make huts and tools. Choosing a place to live in. Look at map 2 below. All the places marked with red triangles are sites from which archaeologists have found evidence of hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers lived in many more places. Many sites were located near sources of water, such as rivers and lakes. As stone tools were important, people tried to find places where good quality stone was easily available. Places where stone was found and where people made tools are known as factory sites. How do we know where these factories were? Usually, we find blocks of stone, tools that were made and perhaps discarded because they were not perfect, and chips of waste stone left behind at these sites. Sometimes, people lived here for longer spells of time. These sites are called habitation-cum-factory sites. If you had to describe the place you live in, which of the terms would you choose? A. Habitation. B. Factory. C. Habitation-cum-factory. D. Any other. Making stone tools. Stone tools were probably made using two different techniques. 1. The first is called stone on stone. Here, the pebble from which the tool was to be made, also called the core, was held in one hand. Another stone, which was used as a hammer, was held in the other hand. The second stone was used to strike off flakes from the first, till the required shape was obtained. 2. Pressure flaking. Here the core was placed on a firm surface. The hammer stone was used on a piece of bone or stone that was placed on the core, to remove flakes that could be shaped into tools. Finding out about fire. Find the Kernul Caves on Map 2. Traces of ash have been found here. This suggests that people were familiar with the use of fire. Fire could have been used for many things, as a source of light, to cook meat, and to scare away animals. What do we use fire for today? A changing environment. Around 12,000 years ago, there were major changes in the climate of the world, with a shift to relatively warm conditions. In many areas, this led to the development of grasslands. This in turn led to an increase in the number of deer, antelope, goat, sheep, and cattle, i.e., animals that survived on grass. Those who hunted these animals now followed them, learning about their food habits and their breeding seasons. It is likely that this helped people to start thinking about herding and rearing these animals themselves. Fishing also became important. This was also a time when several grain-bearing grasses, including wheat, barley and rice, grew naturally in different parts of the subcontinent. Men, women and children probably collected these grains as food, and learnt where they grew, and when they ripened. This may have led them to think about growing plants on their own. Rock paintings and what they tell us of the caves in which these early people lived have paintings on the walls. Some of the best examples are from Madhya Pradesh and southern Uttar Pradesh. These paintings wild animals, drawn with great accuracy and skill. Who did what? We have seen that the earliest people hunted, gathered plant produce, made stone tools, and painted on cave walls. Is there any way of finding out whether women hunted, or men made stone tools, whether women painted or men gathered fruits and nuts? At present, we do not really know. However, there are at least two possibilities. It is likely that both men and women may have done many of these things together. It is also possible that some tasks were done only by women and others only by men. And again, there could have been different practices in different parts of the subcontinent. A closer look. Hunsky. Find Hunsky on Map 2. A number of early Paleolithic sites were found here. At some sites, a large number of tools, used for all sorts of activities, were found. These were probably habitation-cum-factory sites. In some of the other, smaller sites, there is evidence to suggest that tools were made. Some of the sites were close to springs. Most tools were made from limestone, which was locally available. Can you think of a term for the second type of sites? Elsewhere. Find France in your atlas. The painting below is from a cave in France. This site was discovered by 4 school children more than 100 years ago. Paintings like this were made between 20,000 and 10,000 years ago. Many of these were of animals, such as wild horses, aurochs, an older, wild form of cattle, bison, woolly rhinoceros, reindeer, and bear, painted in bright colors. These colors were made from minerals like ochre or iron ore, and charcoal. It is possible that these paintings were done on ceremonial occasions. Or perhaps they were made for special rituals, performed by hunters before they went in search of prey? Can you think of any other reasons? Imagine you live in a rock shelter like the one shown on page 15 about 12,000 years ago. Your uncle is painting one of the inner walls of the cave and you want to help him. Will you mix the colors, draw the lines, fill in the colors? What are the stories he might tell you? Letters with dates. BC, we have seen, stands for before Christ. You will sometimes find AD before dates. This stands for two Latin words, Anno Domini, meaning in the year of the Lord, i.e. Christ. So 2005 can also be written as AD 2005. Sometimes CE is used instead of AD and BCE instead of BC. The letters CE stand for Common Era and BCE for Before Common Era. We use these terms because the Christian era is now used in most countries of the world. In India we began using this form of dating from about 200 years ago. And sometimes, the letters BP meaning before present are used. Find two dates mentioned on page 3. Which set of letters would you use for them? Some important dates. The beginning of agriculture, 8,000 years ago. The first cities on the Indus, 4,700 years ago. Cities in the Ganga Valley, a big kingdom in Magadha, 2,500 years ago. The present, about 2000 AD/CE. Bhimbetka. Bhimbetka, in present-day Madhya Pradesh. Some sites, known as habitation sites, are places where people lived. These include caves and rock shelters such as the one shown here. People chose these natural caves because they provided shelter from the rain, heat, and wind. Natural caves and rock shelters are found in the Vindhyas and the Deccan Plateau. These rock shelters are close to the Narmada Valley. Aims and dates. Archaeologists have given lengthy names for the time that we are studying. They call the earliest period the Paleolithic. This comes from two Greek words, paleo, meaning old, and lithos, meaning stone. The name points to the importance of finds of stone tools. The Paleolithic period extends from 2 million years ago to about 12,000 years ago. This long stretch of time is divided into the lower, middle, and upper Paleolithic. This long span of time covers 99% of human history. The period when we find environmental changes, beginning about 12,000 years ago till about 10,000 years ago, is called the Mesolithic, Middle Stone. Stone tools found during this period are generally tiny, and are called microliths. Microliths were probably stuck onto handles of bone or wood to make tools such as saws and sickles. At the same time, older varieties of tools continued to be in use. Look at the illustration on page 13. Do you notice any difference in the tools belonging to these periods? The next stage, from about 10,000 years ago, is known as the Neolithic. You will be learning about the Neolithic in Chapter 3. What do you think the term Neolithic means? We have also mentioned the name of some places. You will find the names of many more places in later chapters. Very often, we use present-day names of the places where people lived in the past, because we do not know what they called them. Ostriches in India. Ostriches were found in India during the Paleolithic period. Large quantities of ostrich egg shells were found at Patni in Maharashtra. Designs were engraved on some pieces, while beads were also made out of them. What do you think the beads could have been used for? Where do we find ostriches today? Some important dates. The Mesolithic period, 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. The beginning of the Neolithic, 10,000 years ago. Chapter 3. From gathernigs to grow ig food. Nianyua's lunch. Nianya was eating her favorite food: boiled rice, squash, pumpkins, beans and meat. Her grandmother had grown the squash, pumpkin and beans in the little garden plot at the back of her house. She remembered the food had been so different when she had been to Madhya Pradesh as part of a school trip. It was hot and spicy. Why was that so? Varieties of foods. Today, most of our food, such as fruit, vegetables, grain, milk, and meat, comes from plants that are grown and animals that are reared. Different plants grow in different conditions. Rice, for example, requires more water than wheat and barley. This explains why farmers grow some crops in some areas and not in other areas. Different animals too prefer different environments. For instance, sheep and goat can survive more easily than cattle in dry, hilly environments. But, as you saw in Chapter 2, women and men did not always produce their own food. The beginnings of farming and herding. We have seen in Chapter 2 that the climate of the world was changing, and so were plants and animals that people used as food. Men, women, and children probably observed several things: the places where edible plants were found, how seeds broke off stalks, fell on the ground, and new plants sprouted from them. Perhaps they began looking after plants, protecting them from birds and animals so that they could grow and the seeds could ripen. In this way people became farmers. Women, men, and children could also attract and then tame animals by leaving food for them near their shelters. The first animal to be tamed was the wild ancestor of the dog. Later, people encouraged animals that were relatively gentle to come near the camps where they lived. These animals, such as sheep, goat, cattle and also the pig, lived in herds, and most of them ate grass. Often, people protected these animals from attacks by other wild animals. This is how they became herders. Can you think of any reasons why the dog was perhaps the first animal to be tamed? A new way of life. If you plant a seed, you will notice that it takes some time to grow. This may be for several days, weeks, months, and in some cases years. When people began growing plants, it meant that they had to stay in the same place for a long time looking after the plants, watering, weeding, driving away animals and birds till the grain ripened. And then, the grain had to be used carefully. As grain had to be stored for both food and seed, people had to think of ways of storing it. In many areas, they began making large clay pots, or wove baskets, or dug pits into the ground. Do you think hunter-gatherers would have made reasons for your answer? Storing animals and used pots give animals multiply naturally. Besides, if they are looked after carefully, they provide milk, which is an important source of food, and meat, whenever required. In other words, animals that are reared can be used as a store of food. Apart from food, what are the other things that could have been obtained from animals? What are animals used for today? Finding out about the first farmers and herders. Turn to Map 2. You will notice a number of blue squares. Each marks a site from where archaeologists have found evidence of early farmers and herders. These are found all over the subcontinent. Some of the most important ones are in the northwest, in present-day Kashmir, and in East and South India. To find out whether these sites were settlements of farmers and herders, scientists study evidence of plants and animal bones. One of the most exciting finds includes remains of burnt grain. These may have been burnt accidentally or on purpose. Scientists can identify these grains, and so we know that a number of crops were grown in different parts of the subcontinent. They can also identify the bones of different animals. Look at the table below to see where evidence of grain and bones of domesticated animals have been found. Grain and bones. Sites: wheat, barley, sheep, goat, cattle. Murgarh, in present-day Pakistan. Rice, fragmentary animal bones. Koldawa, in present-day Uttar Pradesh. Rice, cattle, hoof marks on clay surface. Mahagara, in present-day Uttar Pradesh. Wheat and lentil. Gufkril, in present-day Kashmir. Wheat and lentil, dog, cattle, sheep, goat, buffalo. Burzahum, in present-day Kashmir. Wheat, green gram, barley, buffalo, ox. Chirand, in present-day Bihar. Millet, cattle, sheep, goat, pig. Halar, in present-day Andhra Pradesh. Black gram, millet, cattle, sheep, pig. Piampali, in present-day Andhra Pradesh. These are just some of the sites from which grain and bones have been found. Towards a settled life. Archaeologists have found traces of huts or houses at some sites. For instance, in Burzahum, in present-day Kashmir, people built pithusas, which were dug into the ground, with steps leading into them. These may have provided shelter in cold weather. Archaeologists have also found cooking hearths both inside and outside the huts, which suggests that, depending outdoors, draw a pit house. On the weather, people could cook food either indoors or stone tools have been found from many sites as well. Many of these are different from the earlier Paleolithic tools, and that is why they are called Neolithic. These include tools that were polished to give a fine cutting edge, and mortars and pestles used for grinding grain and other plant produce. Mortars and pestles are used for grinding grain even today, several thousand years later. At the same time, tools of the Paleolithic types continued to be made and used, and remember, some tools were also made of bone. Many kinds of earthen pots have also been found. These were sometimes decorated, and were used for storing things. People began using pots for cooking food, especially grains like rice, wheat, and lentils that now became an important part of the diet. Besides, they began weaving cloth, using different kinds of materials, for example cotton, that could now be grown. Did things change everywhere and all at once? Not quite. In many areas, men and women still continued to hunt and gather food, and elsewhere people adopted farming and herding slowly, over several thousand years. Besides, in some cases people tried to combine these activities, doing different things during different seasons. What about other customs and practices? Archaeology does not tell us directly about these. Scholars have studied the lives of present-day farmers who practice simple agriculture. They have also studied the lives of herders. Many of these farmers and herders live in groups called tribes. Scholars find that they follow certain customs and practices that may have existed earlier as well. A closer look, A. Living and dying in Mergarh. Find Mergarh on Map 2. This site is located in a fertile plain, near the Bolan Pass, which is one of the most important routes into Iran. Mergarh was probably one of the places where women and men learned to grow barley and wheat, and rear sheep and goats for the first time in this area. It is one of the earliest villages that we know about. Archaeologists who excavated the site found evidence of many kinds of animal bones from the earliest levels. These included bones of wild animals such as the deer and pig. In later levels, they found more bones of sheep and goat, and in still later levels, cattle bones are most common, suggesting that this was the animal that was generally kept by the people. Other finds at Mergarh include remains of square or rectangular houses. Each house had 4 or more compartments, some of which may have been used for storage. When people die, their relatives and friends generally pay respect to them. People look after them, perhaps in the belief that there is some form of life after death. Burial is one such arrangement. Several burial sites have been found at Mergarh. In one instance, the dead person was buried with goats, which were probably meant to serve as food in the next world. A closer look, B. Daya Halai Hating. Find Daya Halai Hating on Map 2. This is a site on the hills near the Brahmaputra Valley, close to routes leading into China and Myanmar. Here stone tools, including mortars and pestles, have been found. These indicate that people were probably growing grain and preparing food from it. Other finds include jadeite, a stone that may have been brought from China. Also common are finds of tools made of fossil wood, ancient wood that has hardened into stone, and pottery. Elsewhere. Find Turkey in your atlas. One of the most famous Neolithic sites, Catalhuyuk, was found in Turkey. Several things were brought from great distances: flint from Syria, cowries from the Red Sea, shells from the Mediterranean Sea, and used in the settlement. Remember, there were no carts. Most things would have been carried on the backs of pack animals such as cattle or by people. What do you think cowries and shells would have been used for? Imagine. You are in charge of a small plot of land and have to decide what food crops to grow. What are the plants you would choose? Where would you get the seeds from? How would you plant them? How would you look after your plants? And when would they be ready for harvesting? Domestication is the name given to the process in which people grow plants and look after animals. Very often, plants and animals that are tended by people become different from wild plants and animals. This is because people select plants and animals for domestication. For example, they select those plants and animals that are not prone to disease. They also select plants that yield large size grain, and have strong stalks, capable of bearing the weight of the ripe grain. Seeds from selected plants are preserved and sown to ensure that new plants, and seeds, will have the same qualities. Amongst animals, those that are relatively gentle are selected for breeding. As a result, gradually, domesticated animals and plants become different from wild animals and plants. For example, the teeth and horns of wild animals are usually much larger than those of domesticated animals. Look at these two sets of teeth. Which do you think belongs to a wild pig and which to a domesticated animal? Domestication was a gradual process that took place in many parts of the world. It began about 12,000 years ago. Virtually all the plant and animal produce that we use as food today is a result of domestication. Some of the earliest plants to be domesticated were wheat and barley. The earliest domesticated animals include sheep and goat. Tribes. Usually 2 to 3 generations live together in small settlements or villages. Most families are related to one another and groups of such families form a tribe. Members of a tribe follow occupations such as hunting, gathering, farming, herding and fishing. Usually, women do most of the agricultural work, including preparing the ground, sowing seeds, looking after the growing plants and harvesting grain. Children often look after plants, driving away animals and birds that might eat them. Women also thresh, husk, and grind grain. Men usually lead large herds of animals in search of pasture. Children often look after small flocks. The cleaning of animals and milking is done by both men and women. Both women and men make pots, baskets, tools and huts. They also take part in singing, dancing and decorating their huts. Some men are regarded as leaders. They may be old and experienced, or young, brave warriors, or priests. Old women are respected for their wisdom and experience. Tribes have rich and unique cultural traditions, including their own language, music, stories, and paintings. They also have their own gods and goddesses. What makes tribes different from many other societies you will be studying about is that land, forests, grasslands, and water are regarded as the wealth of the entire tribe, and everybody shares and uses these together. There are no sharp differences between the rich and the poor. Make a list of all the activities performed by men in tribal societies. What do women do? Are there any activities that are done by both men and women? Some important dates. Beginnings of domestication, about 12,000 years ago. Beginning of settlement at Murgarh, about 8,000 years ago. Chapter 4. In the earliest cities. Saving an old building. Jaspal and Harpreet were playing cricket in the lane outside their home when they noticed the people who were admiring the dilapidated old building that the children called the haunted house. "Look at the architecture," said one of the men. "Have you seen the fine wood carving?" asked one of the women. "We must write to the minister so that she makes arrangements to repair and preserve this beautiful house." Why, they wondered, would anybody be interested in the old, run-down house? The story of Harappa. Very often, old buildings have a story to tell. Nearly 150 years ago, when railway lines were being laid down for the first time in the Punjab, engineers stumbled upon the site of Harappa in present-day Pakistan. To them, it seemed like a mountain that was a rich source of ready-made, high-quality bricks. So they carried off thousands of bricks from the walls of the old buildings of the city to build railway lines. Many buildings were completely destroyed. Then, about 80 years ago, archaeologists found the site, and realized that this was one of the oldest cities in the subcontinent. As this was the first city to be discovered, all other sites from where similar buildings, and other things, were found were described as Harappan. These cities developed about 4,700 years ago. Very often, old buildings are pulled down to make way for new construction. Do you think it is important to preserve old buildings? What was special about these cities? Many of these cities were divided into two or more parts. Usually, the part to the west was smaller but higher. Archaeologists describe this as the citadel. Generally, the part to the east was larger but lower. This is called the lower town. Very often walls of baked brick were built around each part. The bricks were so well made that they have lasted for thousands of years. The bricks were laid in an interlocking pattern and that made the walls strong. In some cities, special buildings were constructed on the citadel. For example, in Mohenjo-daro, a very special tank, which archaeologists call the Great Bath, was built in this area. This was lined with bricks, coated with plaster, and made watertight with a layer of natural tar. There were steps leading down to it from two sides, while there were rooms on all sides. Water was probably brought in from a well, and drained out after use. Perhaps important people took a dip in this tank on special occasions. Other cities, such as Kalibangan and Lithal, had fire altars, where sacrifices may have been performed. And some cities like Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and Lithal had elaborate storehouses. Houses, drains and streets. Generally, houses were either 1 or 2 stories high, with rooms built around a courtyard. Most houses had a separate bathing area, and some had wells to supply water. Many of these cities had covered drains. Notice how carefully these were laid out, in straight lines. Although you cannot see it, each drain had a gentle slope so that water could flow through it. Very often, drains in houses were connected to those on the streets. And smaller drains led into bigger ones. As the drains were covered, inspection holes were provided at intervals to clean them. All 3 houses, drains and streets were probably planned and built at the same time. List at least 2 differences between the houses described here and those that you studied about in Chapter 3. Life in the city. A Harappan city was a very busy place. There were people who planned the construction of special buildings in the city. These were probably the rulers. It is likely that the rulers sent people to distant lands to get metal, precious stones, and other things that they wanted. They may have kept the most valuable objects, such as ornaments of gold and silver, or beautiful beads, for themselves. And there were scribes, people who knew how to write, who helped prepare the seals, and perhaps wrote on other materials that have not survived. Besides, there were men and women, craftspersons, making all kinds of things either in their own homes, or in special workshops. People were traveling to distant lands or returning with raw materials and, perhaps, stories. Many terracotta toys have been found, and a long time ago children must have played with these. Make a list of the people who lived in the city. Were any of these people listed as living in villages such as Margarha? New crafts in the city. Let us look at some of the objects that were made and found in Harappan cities. Most of the things that have been found by archaeologists are made of stone, shell, and metal, including copper, bronze, gold and silver. Copper and bronze were used to make tools, weapons, ornaments, and vessels. Gold and silver were used to vessels, make ornaments and perhaps the most striking finds are those of beads, weights, and blades. The Harappans also made seals out of stone. These are generally rectangular and usually have an animal carved on them. Was stone used to make weights? Cotton was probably grown at Margarha from about 7,000 years ago. Actual pieces of cloth were found attached to the lid of a silver vase and some copper objects at Mohenjo-daro. Archaeologists have also found spindle whorls, made of terracotta and faience. These were used to spin thread. Many of the things that were produced were probably the work of specialists. A specialist is a person who is trained to do only one kind of work, for example, cutting stone, or polishing beads, or carving seals. Look at the illustration and see how well the face is carved and how carefully the beard is shown. This must have been the work of an expert craftsperson. Not everybody could have been a specialist. We do not know whether only men were specialists or only women been specialists. Were specialists. Perhaps some women and men may have. In search of raw materials. Raw materials are substances that are either found naturally, such as wood, or ores of metals, or produced by farmers or herders. These are then processed to produce finished goods. For example, cotton, produced by farmers, is a raw material that may be processed to make cloth. While some of the raw materials that the Harappans used were available locally, many items such as copper, tin, gold, silver and precious stones had to be brought from distant places. The Harappans probably got copper from present-day Rajasthan, and even from Oman. In West Asia, tin, which was mixed with copper to produce bronze, may have been brought from present-day Afghanistan and Iran. Gold could have come all the way from present-day Karnataka, and precious stones from present-day Afghanistan, Gujarat, Iran and food for people in the cities. While many people lived in the cities, others living in the countryside grew crops and reared animals. These farmers and herders supplied food to craftspersons, scribes, and rulers in the cities. We know from remains of plants that the Harappans grew wheat, barley, pulses, peas, rice, sesame, linseed and mustard. A new tool, the plough, was used to dig the earth for turning the soil and planting seeds. While real ploughs, which were probably made of wood, have not survived, toy models have been found. As this region does not receive heavy rainfall, some form of irrigation may have been used. This means that water was stored and supplied to the fields when the plants were growing. The Harappans reared cattle, sheep, goat, and buffalo. Water and pastures were available around settlements. However, in the dry summer months large herds of animals were probably taken to greater distances in search of grass and water. They also collected fruits like burr, caught fish, and hunted wild animals like the antelope. A closer look: Harappan towns in Gujarat. The city of Dholavira was located on Khadur Bait in the Rann of Kutch, where there was fresh water and fertile soil. Unlike some of the other Harappan cities, which were divided into two parts, Dholavira was divided into three parts, and each part was surrounded with massive stone walls, with entrances through gateways. There was also a large open area in the settlement, where public ceremonies could be held. Other finds including nude large letters of the Harappan script that were carved out of white stone and perhaps inlaid in wood. This is a unique find as generally Harappan writing has been found on small objects such as seals. The city of Lathul stood beside a tributary of the Sabarmati, in Gujarat, close to the Gulf of Cambat. It was situated near areas where raw materials such as semi-precious stones were easily available. This was an important center for making objects out of stone, shell, and metal. There was also a storehouse in the city. Many seals and sealings. The impression of seals on clay were found in this storehouse. A building that was found here was probably a workshop for making beads, pieces of stone, half-made beads, tools for bead making, and finished beads have all been found here. The mystery of the end. Around 3,900 years ago we find the beginning of a major change. People stopped living in many of the cities. Writing, seals, and weights were no longer used. Raw materials brought from long distances became rare. In Mohenjo-daro, we find that garbage piled up on the streets, the drainage system broke down, and new, less impressive houses were built, even over the streets. Why did all this happen? We are not sure. Some scholars suggest that the rivers dried up. Others suggest that there was deforestation. This could have happened because fuel was required for baking bricks, and for smelting copper ores. Besides, grazing by large herds of cattle, sheep, and goat may have destroyed the green cover. In some areas there were floods. But none of these reasons can explain the end of all the cities. Flooding, or a river drying up would have had an effect in only some areas. It appears as if the rulers lost control. In any case, the effects of the change are quite clear. Sites in Sindh and West Punjab, present-day Pakistan, were abandoned, while many people moved into newer, smaller settlements to the east and the south. New cities emerged about 1,400 years later. You will read about them in chapters 6 and 9. Elsewhere. Find Egypt in your atlas. Most of Egypt is a dry desert, except for the lands along the river Nile. Around 5,000 years ago, kings ruled over Egypt. These kings sent armies to distant lands to get gold, silver, ivory, timber, and precious stones. They also built huge tombs, known as pyramids. When they died, the bodies of kings were preserved and buried in these pyramids. These carefully preserved bodies are known as mummies. A large number of objects were also buried with them. These included food and drink, clothes, ornaments, utensils, musical instruments, weapons, and animals. Sometimes even serving men and women were buried with the rulers. These are amongst the most elaborate burials known in world history. Do you think kings would have needed these things after death? Imagine. You are traveling with your parents, about 4,000 years ago, from Lothal to Mohenjo-daro. Describe how you would travel, what your parents might carry with them, and what you would see in Mohenjo-daro. Some important dates. Cotton cultivation at Murgarh, about 7,000 years ago. Beginning of cities, about 4,700 years ago. Beginning of the end of these cities, about 3,900 years ago. The emergence of outer cities, about 2,500 years ago. Faience. Unlike stone or shell, that are found naturally, faience is a material that is artificially produced. A gum was used to shape sand or powdered quartz into an object. The objects were then glazed, resulting in a shiny, glassy surface. The colors of the glaze were usually blue or sea green. Faience was used to make beads, bangles, earrings, and tiny vessels. Seals and sealings. Seals may have been used to stamp bags or packets containing goods that were sent from one place to another. After a bag was closed or tied, a layer of wet clay was applied on the knot, and the seal was pressed on it. The impression of the seal is known as a sealing. If the sealing was intact, one could be sure that the goods had arrived safely. Seals are used even today. Find out what they are used for. Chapter 5. What books and burials tell us? Mary in the library. As the bell rang, the teacher asked the students to follow him, because they were going to the library for the first time. When Mary stepped inside, she found that the library was much larger than their classroom. And there were so many shelves, all full of books. In one corner was a cupboard filled with large, old volumes. Seeing her trying to open the cupboard, the teacher said, "That cupboard has very special books on different religions. Did you know that we have a set of the Vedas?" "What are the Vedas?" Mary wondered. "Let us find out." "One of the oldest books in the world. You may have heard about the Vedas. There are 4 of them: the Rigveda, Samaveda, Yajurveda, and Atharvaveda. The oldest Veda is the Rigveda, composed about 3,500 years ago. The Rigveda includes more than 1,000 hymns, called Sukta or well said. These hymns are in praise of various gods and goddesses. 3. Gods are especially important: Agni, the god of fire; Indra, a warrior god; and Soma, a plant from which a special drink was prepared. These hymns were composed by sages, rishis. Priests taught students to recite and memorize each syllable, word, and sentence, bit by bit, with great care. Most of the hymns were composed, taught and learnt by men. A few were composed by women. The Rigveda is in Old or Vedic Sanskrit, which is different from the Sanskrit you learn in school these days. The books we use are written and printed. The Rigveda was recited and heard rather than read. It was written down several centuries after it was first composed, and printed less than 200 years ago. How historians study the Rigveda. Historians, like archaeologists, find out about the past, but, in addition to material remains, they examine written sources as well. Let us see how they study the Rigveda. Some of the hymns in the Rigveda are in the form of dialogues. This is part of one such hymn, a dialogue between a sage named Vishvamitra, and 2 rivers, Beas and Sutlej, that were worshipped as goddesses. Find the rivers on map 1, then read on. Cattle, horses, and chariots. There are many prayers in the Rigveda for cattle, children, especially sons, and horses. Horses were yoked to chariots that were used in battles, which were fought to capture cattle. Battles were also fought for land, which was important for pasture, and for growing hardy crops that ripened quickly, such as barley. Some battles were fought for water, and to capture people. Some of the wealth that was obtained was kept by the leaders, some was given to the priests and the rest was distributed amongst the people. Some wealth was used for the performance of yajnas or sacrifices in which offerings were made into the fire. These were meant for gods and goddesses. Offerings could include ghee, grain, and in some cases, animals. Most men took part in these wars. There was no regular army, but there were assemblies where people met and discussed matters of war and peace. They also chose leaders, who were often brave and skillful warriors. Words to describe people. There are several ways of describing people in terms of the work they do, the language they speak, the place they belong to, their family, their communities and cultural practices. Let us see some of the words used to describe Rigveda. People found in the. There are 2 groups who are described in terms of their work: the priests, sometimes called Brahmins, who performed various rituals, and the Rajas. These Rajas were not like the ones you will be learning about later. They did not have capital, armies, nor did they collect taxes. Generally, sons did not automatically succeed fathers as Rajas. Cities, palaces or. Read the previous section once more and see whether you can find out what the Rajas did. 2 words were used to describe the people or the community as a whole. One was the word Jana, which we still use in Hindi and other languages. The other was Vish. The word Vaishya comes from Vish. You will learn more about this in chapter 6. Several Vish or Jana are mentioned by name. So we find reference to the Pura Jana or Vish, the Bharata Jana or Vish, the Yadu Jana or Vish, and so on. Do any of these names sound familiar? Sometimes, the people who composed the hymns described themselves as Aryas and called their opponents Dases or Dacius. These were people who did not perform sacrifices, and probably spoke different languages. Later, the term Dasa, and the feminine Dasi, came to mean slave. Slaves were women and men who were often captured in war. They were treated as the property of their owners, who could make them do whatever work they wanted. While the Rigveda was being composed in the northwest of the subcontinent, there were other developments elsewhere. Let us look at some of these. Silent Sentinels, the story of the megaliths. Look at the illustration on the next page. These stone boulders are known as megaliths, literally big stones. These were carefully arranged by people, and were used to mark burial sites. The practice of erecting megaliths began about 3,000 years ago, and was prevalent throughout the Deccan, South India, in the northeast and Kashmir. Some important megalithic sites are shown on map 2. While some megaliths can be seen on the surface, other megalithic burials are often underground. Sometimes, archaeologists find a circle of stone boulders or a single large stone standing on the ground. These are the only indications that there are burials beneath. There were several things that people did to make megaliths. We have made a list here. Try and arrange them in the correct order: digging pits in the earth, transporting stones, breaking boulders, placing, burying the dead, stones in position, finding suitable stone, shaping stones. All these burials have some common features. Generally, the dead were buried with distinctive pots, which are called black and red ware. Also found are tools and weapons of iron and sometimes skeletons of horses, horse equipment, and ornaments of stone and gold. Was iron used in the Harappan cities? Finding out about social differences. Archaeologists think that objects found with a skeleton probably belonged to the dead person. Sometimes, more objects are found in one grave than in another. Find Brahmagiri on map 2. Here, one skeleton was buried with 33 gold beads, 2 stone beads, 4 copper bangles, and 1 conch shell. Other skeletons have only a few pots. These finds suggest that there was some difference in status amongst the people who were buried. Some were rich, others poor, some chiefs, others followers. Were some burial spots meant for certain families? Sometimes, megaliths contain more than one skeleton. These indicate that people, perhaps belonging to the same family, were buried in the same place though not at the same time. The bodies of those who died later were brought into the grave through the portholes. Stone circles or boulders placed on the surface probably served as signposts to find the burial site, so that people could return to the same place whenever they wanted to. A special burial at Inamgaon. Find Inamgaon on map 2. It is a site on the river Gode, a tributary of the Bhima. It was occupied between 3,600 and 2,700 years ago. Here, adults were generally buried in the ground, laid out straight, with the head towards the north. Sometimes burials were within the houses. Vessels that probably contained food and water were placed with the dead. One man was found buried in a large, 4-legged clay jar in the courtyard of a 5-roomed house, one of the largest houses at the site, in the center of the settlement. This house also had a granary. The body was placed in a cross-legged position. Do you think this was the body of a chief? Give reasons for your answer. Occupations at Inamgaon. Archaeologists have found seeds of wheat, barley, rice, pulses, millets, peas and sesame. Bones of a number of animals, many bearing cut marks that show they may have been used as food, have also been found. These include cattle, buffalo, goat, sheep, dog, horse, ass, pig, samhar, spotted deer, black buck, antelope, hare, and mongoose, besides birds, crocodile, turtle, crab and fish. There is evidence that fruits such as bur, amla, jamun, dates and a variety of berries were collected. Use this evidence to list the possible occupations of the people at Namjiaon. Elsewhere. Find China in your atlas. Around 3,500 years ago, we find some of the first evidence of writing in China. These writings were on animal bones. These are called oracle bone, because they were used to predict the future. Kings got scribes to write questions on the bones. Would they win battles? Would the harvest be good? Would they have sons? The bones were then put into the fire, and they cracked because of the heat. Then fortune tellers studied these cracks, and tried to predict the future. As you may expect, they sometimes made mistakes. These kings lived in palaces and cities. They amassed vast quantities of wealth, including large, elaborately decorated bronze vessels. However, they did not know the use of iron. List one difference between the Raja of the Rigveda and these kings. Imagine. You live in Namjiaon, 3,000 years ago, and the chief has died last night. Today, your parents are preparing for the burial. Describe the scene, including how food is being prepared for the funeral. What do you think would be offered? Some important dates. Beginning of the composition of the Vedas, about 3,500 years ago. Beginning of the building of megaliths, about 3,000 years ago. Settlement at Namjiaon, between 3,600 and 2,700 years ago. Sharika, about 2,000 years ago. Sanskrit and other languages. Sanskrit is part of a family of languages known as Indo-European. Some Indian languages such as Assamese, Gujarati, Hindi, Kashmiri and Sindhi, and many European languages such as English, French, German, Greek, Italian and Spanish belong to this family. They are called a family because they originally had words in common. Take the words major, Sanskrit, Ma, Hindi, and mother, English. Do you notice any similarities? Other languages used in the subcontinent belong to different families. For instance, those used in the northeast belong to the Tibeto-Burman family, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada and Malayalam belong to the Dravidian family, and the languages spoken in Jharkhand and parts of central India belong to the Austroasiatic family. List the languages you have heard about and try and identify the families to which they belong. Vishvamitra and the rivers. Vishvamitra, O rivers, come down from the mountains like two swift horses, like two shining cows that lick their calves. You move like chariots to the sea, through the power of Indra. You are full of water and wish to unite with one another. The rivers, we, who are full of water, move along the path the gods have made for us. Once we start flowing, we cannot be stopped. Why do you pray to us, O sage? Vishvamitra, O sisters, please listen to me, the singer who has come from a distance with his chariots and carts. Let your waters not rise above our axles, so that we can cross safely. The rivers, we will listen to your prayers so that you can cross safely. Historians point out that this hymn was composed in the area where these rivers flow. They also suggest that the sage lived in a society where horses and cows were valued animals. That is why the rivers are compared to horses and cows. Do you think chariots were also important? Give reasons for your answer. Read the verses and find out what are the modes of transport that are mentioned. Other rivers, especially the Indus and its other tributaries, and the Sarasvati, are also named in the hymns. The Ganga and Yamuna are named only once. What skeletal studies tell us? It is easy to make out the skeleton of a child from its small size. However, there are no major differences in the bones of a girl and a boy. Can we make out whether a skeleton was that of a man or a woman? Sometimes, people decide on the basis of what is found with the skeleton. For instance, if a skeleton is found with jewelry, it is sometimes thought to be that of a woman. However, there are problems with this. Often, men also wore ornaments. A better way of figuring out the sex of a skeleton is to look at the bone structure. The hip or the pelvic area of women is generally larger to enable childbearing. These distinctions are based on modern skeletal studies. About 2000 years ago, there was a famous physician named Sharaka who wrote a book on medicine known as the Sharaka Samhita. There he states that the human body has 360 bones. This is a much larger number than the 200 bones that are recognized in modern anatomy. Sharaka arrived at this figure by counting the teeth, joints, and cartilage. How do you think he found out about the human body in such great detail? Chapter 6. Kingdoms, Kings, and an Early Republic. Election Day. Shankaran woke up to see his grandparents all ready to go and vote. They wanted to be the first to reach the polling booth. Why, Shankaran wanted to know, were they so excited? Somewhat. Impatiently, his grandfather explained, we can choose our own rulers today. How some men became rulers. Choosing leaders or rulers by voting is something that has become common during the last 50 years or so. How did men become rulers in the past? Some of the Rajas we read about in chapter 5 were probably chosen by the Jana, the people. But, around 3000 years ago, we find some changes taking place in the ways in which Rajas were chosen. Some men now became recognized as Rajas by performing very big sacrifices. The Ashvamedha or horse sacrifice was one such ritual. A horse was let loose to wander freely and it was guarded by the Raja's men. If the horse wandered into the kingdoms of other Rajas and they stopped it, they had to fight. If they allowed the horse to pass, it meant that they accepted that the Raja who wanted to perform the sacrifice was stronger than them. These Rajas were then invited to the sacrifice, which was performed by specially trained priests, who were rewarded with gifts. The Raja who organized the sacrifice was recognized as being very powerful, and all those who came brought gifts for him. The Raja was a central figure in these rituals. He often had a special seat, a throne, or a tiger skin. His charioteer, who was his companion in the battlefield and witnessed his exploits, chanted tales of his glory. His relatives, especially his wives and sons, had to perform a variety of minor rituals. The other Rajas were simply spectators who had to sit and watch the performance of the sacrifice. Priests performed the sprinkling of sacred water on the king. The ordinary people, the rituals including the Vish or Vaishya, also brought gifts. However, some people, such as those who were regarded as Shudras by the priests, were excluded from many rituals. Make a list of all those who would be present at the sacrifice. Which are the categories occupation, Janapadas, that are described in terms of the Rajas who performed. These big sacrifices were now recognized as being Rajas of Janapadas rather than Janas. The word Janapada literally means the land where the Jana set its foot, and settled down. Some important Janapadas are shown on map. Archaeologists have excavated a number of settlements in these Janapadas, such as Puranikila in Delhi, Hastinapur near Meerut, and Atranjikra, near Ada. The last two are in Uttar Pradesh. They found that people lived in huts, and kept cattle as well as other animals. They also grew a variety of crops: rice, wheat, barley, pulses, sugarcane, sesame and mustard. Is there a crop in this list that was not mentioned in chapter 4? They made earthen pots. Some of these were grey in color, others were red. One special type of pottery found at these sites is known as painted grey ware. As is obvious from the name, these grey pots had painted designs, usually simple lines and geometric patterns. Mahajanapadas. About 2,500 years ago, some Janapadas became more important than others, and were known as Mahajanapadas. Some of these are shown on map 4. Most Mahajanapadas had a capital city, many of these were fortified. This means that huge walls of wood, brick, or stone were built around them. Forts were probably built because people were afraid of attacks from other kings and needed protection. It is also likely that some rulers wanted to show how rich and Powerful they were by building really large, tall, and impressive walls around their cities. Also in this way, the land and the people living inside the fortified area could be controlled more easily by the king. Building such huge walls required a great deal of planning. Thousands, if not lakhs of bricks or stone had to be prepared. This in turn meant enormous labor, provided, possibly, by thousands of men, women, and children. And resources had to be found for all of this. The new Rajas now began maintaining armies. Soldiers were paid regular salaries and maintained by the king throughout the year. Some payments were probably made using punch-marked coins. List 2 ways in which the Rajas of the Mahajanapadas were mentioned in the Rigveda. Taxes. As the rulers of the Mahajanapadas were different from those. A. Building huge forts. B. Maintaining big armies, they needed more resources. And they needed officials to collect these. So, instead of depending on occasional gifts brought by people, as in the case of the Raja of the Janapadas, they started collecting regular taxes. Taxes on crops were the most important. This was because most people were farmers. Usually, the tax was fixed at 1/6 of what was produced. This was known as bhaga or a share. There were taxes on craftspersons as well. These could have been in the form of labor. For example, a weaver or a smith may have had to work for a day every month for the king. Herders were also expected to pay taxes in the form of animals and animal produce. There were also taxes on goods that were bought and sold through trade. And hunters and gatherers also had to provide forest produce to the Raja. What do you think would have been provided by hunters and gatherers? Changes in agriculture. There were 2 major changes in agriculture around this time. One was the growing use of iron plowshares. This meant that heavy, clayey soil could be turned over better than with a wooden plowshare, so that more grain could be produced. Second, people began transplanting paddy. This meant that instead of scattering seed on the ground, from which plants would sprout, saplings were grown and then planted in the fields. This led to increased production, as many more plants survived. However, it was back-breaking work. Generally, slave men and women, dasas and dasas, and laborers, kamakaras, had to do this work. Landless agricultural. Can you think why kings would encourage these changes? A closer look. A. Magadha. Find Magadha on map 4. Magadha became the most important Mahajanapada in about 200 years. Many rivers such as the Ganga and Sun flowed through Magadha. This was important for A. Transport, B. Water supplies, C. Making the land fertile. Parts of Magadha were forested. Elephants, which lived in the forest, could be captured and trained for the army. Forests also provided wood for building houses, carts and chariots. Besides, there were iron ore mines in the region that could be tapped to make strong tools and weapons. Magadha had 2 very powerful rulers, Bimbisara and Ajatasattu, who used all possible means to conquer other Janapadas. Mahapadmananda was another important ruler. He extended his control up to the northwest part of the subcontinent. Rajagriha, present-day Rajgir, in Bihar was the capital of Magadha for several years. Later the capital was shifted to Pataliputra, present-day Patna. More than 2,300 years ago, a ruler named Alexander, who lived in Macedonia in Europe, wanted to become a world conqueror. Of course, he did not conquer the world, but did conquer parts of Egypt and West Asia, and came to the Indian subcontinent, reaching up to the banks of the Beas. When he wanted to march further eastwards, his soldiers refused. They were scared, as they had heard that the rulers of India had vast armies of foot soldiers, chariots, and elephants. In what ways were these armies different from those described in the Rigveda? A closer look. B. Vajji. While Magadha became a powerful kingdom, Vajji with its capital at Vaishali, Bihar, was under a different form of government, known as Gana or Sangha. In a Gana or a Sangha there were not one, but many rulers. Sometimes, even when thousands of men ruled together, each one was known as a Raja. These Rajas performed rituals together. They also met in assemblies, and decided what had to be done and how, through discussion and debate. For example, if they were attacked by an enemy, they met to discuss what should be done to meet the threat. However, Kamakaras could not participate in these assemblies. Women, Dasas and both the Buddha and Mahavira belonged to Ganas or Sanghas. Some of the most vivid descriptions of life in the Sanghas can be found in Buddhist books. This is an account of the Vajis from the Digha, a famous Buddhist book, which contains some of the speeches of the Buddha. These were written down about 2,300 years ago. Rajas of powerful kingdoms tried to conquer the Sanghas. Nevertheless, these lasted for a very long time, till about 1,500 years ago, when the last of the Ganas or Sanghas were conquered by the Gupta rulers, about whom you will read in chapter 11. Elsewhere. Find Greece and Athens in your atlas. Around 2,500 years ago, the people of Athens set up a form of government, which was called a democracy, which lasted for about 200 years. All free men over the age of 30 were recognized as full citizens. There was an assembly that met at least 40 times a year to decide on important matters. All citizens could attend these meetings. Appointments for many positions were made through lottery. All those who wanted to be chosen gave in their names, and then some were selected through lottery. Citizens were expected to serve in the army and the navy. However, women were not considered citizens. Also, many foreigners, who lived and worked in Athens as merchants and craftspersons did not have rights as citizens. Besides, there were several thousand slaves in Athens, who worked in mines, fields, households, and workshops. They too were not treated as citizens. Do you think this was a true democracy? Imagine. You are peeping through a crack in the walls of the assembly of Vaishali, where a meeting is in progress to discuss ways to deal with an attack by the king of Magadha. Describe what you might hear. Some important dates. New kinds of Rajas. About 3,000 years ago. Mahajanapadas, about 2,500 years ago. Alexander's invasion composition of the Digha, about 2,300 years ago. End of Theganazar Sanghas, about 1,500 years ago. Varnas. We have many books that were composed in North India, especially in the areas drained by the Ganga and the Yamuna, during this period. These books are often called later Vedic, because they were composed after the Rigveda about which you learned in chapter 5. These include the Samaveda, Yajurveda, and Atharvaveda, as well as other books. These were composed by priests, and described how rituals were to be performed. They also contained rules about society. There were several different groups in society at this time: priests and warriors, farmers, herders, traders, craftspersons, laborers, fishing folk, and forest people. Some priests and warriors were rich, as were some farmers and traders. Others, including many herders, craftspersons, laborers, fishing folk, and hunters and gatherers, were poor. The priests divided people into 4 groups, called Varnas. According to them, each Varna had a different set of functions. The first Varna was that of the Brahmin. Brahmins were expected to study, and teach, the Vedas, perform sacrifices and receive gifts. In the second place were the rulers, also known as Kshatriyas. They were expected to fight battles and protect people. Third were the Vish or the Vaishyas. They were expected to be farmers, herders, and traders. Both the Kshatriyas and the Vaishyas could perform sacrifices. Last were the Shudras, who had to serve the other 3 groups and could not perform any rituals. Often, women were also grouped with the Shudras. Both women and Shudras were not allowed to study the Vedas. The priests also said that these groups were decided on the basis of birth. For example, if one's father and mother were Brahmins one would automatically become a Brahmin, and so on. Later, they classified some people as untouchable. These included some craftspersons, hunters and gatherers, as well as people who helped perform burials and cremations. The priests said that contact with these groups was polluting. Many people did not accept the system of Varna laid down by the Brahmins. Some kings thought they were superior to the priests. Others felt that birth could not be a basis for deciding which Varna people belonged to. Besides, some people felt that there should be no differences amongst people based on occupation. Others felt that everybody should be able to perform rituals. And others condemned the practice of untouchability. Also, there were many areas in the subcontinent, such as the Northeast, where social and economic differences were not very sharp, and where the influence of the priests was limited. Why did people oppose the system of Varnas? Painted grey ware. Painted grey ware. Plates and bowls are the most common vessels made out of painted grey ware. These are extremely fine to touch, with a nice, smooth surface. Perhaps these were used on special occasions, for important people, and to serve special food. Ajatasattu and the Vajis. Ajatasattu wanted to attack the Vajis. He sent his minister named Vasakara to the Buddha to get his advice on the matter. The Buddha asked whether the Vajis met frequently, in full assemblies. When he heard that they did, he replied that the Vajis would continue to prosper as long as they held full and frequent public assemblies. They met and acted together. They followed established rules. They respected, supported, and listened to elders. Vaji women were not held by force or captured. Chaitayas, local shrines, were maintained in both towns and villages. Wise saints who followed different beliefs were respected and allowed to enter and leave the country freely. In what ways was the Vaji Sangha different from the other Mahajanapadas? Try and list at least 3 differences. Chapter 7. New questions and ideas. Anaga's school trip. This was the first time Anaga was going on a school trip. They boarded the train from Pune, in Maharashtra, late at night, to go all the way to Varanasi, in Uttar Pradesh. Her mother, who came to see her off at the station, told the teacher, "Do tell the children about the Buddha, and take them to see Sarnath as well." The story of the Buddha. Siddhartha, also known as Gautama, the founder of Buddhism, was born about 2500 years ago. This was a time of rapid change in the lives of people. As you saw in Chapter 6, some kings in the Mahajanapadas were growing more powerful. New cities were developing, and life was changing in the villages as well. Many thinkers were trying to understand these changes. Meaning of life in society. They also wanted to try and find out the true. The Buddha belonged to a small Gana known as the Sakya Gana, and was a Kshatriya. When he was a young man, he left the comforts of his home in search of knowledge. He wandered for several years, meeting and holding discussions with other thinkers. He finally decided to find his own path to realization, and meditated for days on end under a peepal tree at Bodh Gaya in Bihar, where he attained enlightenment. After that, he was known as the Buddha or the Wise One. He then went to Sarnath, near Varanasi, where he taught for the first time. He spent the rest of his life traveling on foot, going from place to place, teaching people, till he passed away at Kusinara. The Buddha taught that life is full of suffering and unhappiness. This is caused because we have cravings and desires, which often cannot be fulfilled. Sometimes, even if we get what we want, we are not satisfied, and want even more, or want other things. The Buddha described this as thirst or tanha. He taught that this constant craving could be removed by following moderation in everything. He also taught people to be kind, and to respect the lives of others, including animals. He believed that the results of our actions, called karma, whether good or bad, affect us both, in this life and the next. The Buddha taught in the language of the ordinary people. Prakrit, so that everybody could understand his message. What was the language used to compose the Vedas? He also encouraged people to think for themselves rather than to simply accept what he said. Let us see how he did this. Upanishads. Around the time that the Buddha was preaching, and perhaps a little earlier, other thinkers also tried to find answers to difficult questions. Some of them wanted to know about life after death, others wanted to know why sacrifices should be performed. Many of these thinkers felt that there was something permanent in the universe that would last even after death. They described this as the Atman or the individual soul and the Brahman or the universal soul. They believed that ultimately, both the Atman and the Brahman were one. Many of their ideas were recorded in the Upanishads. These were part of the later Vedic texts. Upanishad literally means approaching and sitting near, in the texts contain conversations between teachers and students. Often, ideas were presented through simple dialogues. Most Upanishad thinkers were men, especially Brahmins and Rajas. Occasionally, there is mention of women thinkers, such as Gargi, who was famous for her learning, and participated in debates held in royal courts. Poor people rarely took part in these discussions. One famous exception was Satyakama Jabala, who was named after his mother, the slave woman Jabali. He had a deep desire to learn about reality, was accepted as a student by a Brahmin teacher named Gautama, and became one of the best-known thinkers of the time. Many of the ideas of the Upanishads were later developed by the famous thinker Shankaracharya, about whom you will read in class 7th. Jainism. The most famous thinker of the Jainas, Vardhamana Mahavira, also spread his message around this time, i.e. 2,500 years ago. He was a Kshatriya prince of the Likshavas, a group that was part of the Vaji Sangha, about which you read in chapter 6. At the age of 30, he left home and went to live in a forest. For 12 years he led a hard and lonely life, at the end of which he attained enlightenment. He taught a simple doctrine: men and women who wished to know the truth must leave their homes. They must follow very strictly the rules of ahimsa, which means not hurting or killing living beings. All beings, said Mahavira, long to live. To all things life is dear. Ordinary people could understand the teachings of Mahavira and his followers, because they used Prakrit. There were several forms of Prakrit, used in different parts of the country, and named after the regions in which they were used. For example, the Prakrit spoken in Magadha was known as Magadhi. Followers of Mahavira, who were known as Jainas, had to lead very simple lives, begging for food. They had to be absolutely honest, and were especially asked not to steal. Also, they had to observe celibacy. And men had to give up everything, including their clothes. It was very difficult for most men and women to follow these strict rules. Nevertheless, thousands left their homes to learn and teach this new way of life. Many more remained behind and supported those who became monks and nuns, providing them with food. Jainism was supported mainly by traders. Farmers, who had to kill insects to protect their crops, found it more difficult to follow the rules. Over hundreds of years, Jainism spread to different parts of North India, and to Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka. The teachings of Mahavira and his followers were transmitted orally for several centuries. They were written down in the form in which they are presently called Vallabhi, in Gujarat, about 1,500 years ago. The Sangha. Available at a place. Both the Mahavira and the Buddha felt that only those who left their homes could gain true knowledge. They arranged for them to stay together in the Sangha, an association of those who left their homes. The rules made for the Buddhist Sangha were written down in a book called the Vinaya Pitaka. From this we know that there were separate branches for men and women. All men could join the Sangha. However, children had to take the permission of their parents, and slaves that of their masters. Those who worked for the king had to take his permission, and debtors that of creditors. Women had to take their husband's permission. Men and women who joined the Sangha led simple lives. They meditated for most of the time, and went to cities and villages to beg for food during fixed hours. That is why they were known as bhikkhus, the Prakrit word for beggar, and bhikkhunis. They taught others, and helped one another. They also held meetings to settle any quarrels that took place within the Sangha. Those who joined the Sangha included Brahmins, Kshatriyas, merchants, laborers, barbers, courtesans, and slaves. Many of them wrote down the teachings of the Buddha. Some of them also composed beautiful poems, describing their life in the Sangha. List at least 2 ways in which the Sangha described in this lesson was different from the one mentioned in Chapter 6. Were there any similarities? Monasteries. To begin with, both Jaina and Buddhist monks went from place to place throughout the year, teaching people. The season, when it was very only time they stayed in one place was during the rainy, difficult to travel. Then, their supporters built temporary shelters for them in gardens, or they lived in natural caves in hilly areas. As time went on, many supporters of the monks and nuns, and they themselves, felt the need for more permanent shelters, and so monasteries were built. These were known as viharas. The earliest viharas were made of wood, and then of brick. Some were even in caves that were dug out in hills, especially in western India. Very often, the land on which the vihara was built was donated by a rich merchant or a landowner, or the king. The local people came with gifts of food, clothing, and medicines for the monks and nuns. In return, they taught the people. Over the centuries, Buddhism spread to many parts of the subcontinent and beyond. You will learn more about this in Chapter 10. Elsewhere. Find Iran in your atlas. Zoroaster was an Iranian prophet. His teachings are contained in a book called the Avesta. The language of the Avesta, and the practices described in it are very similar to those of the Vedas. The basic teachings of Zoroaster are contained in the maxim good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Here is a verse from the Zend Avesta. Lord, grant strength and the rule of truth and good thinking, by means of which one shall create peace and tranquility. For more than 1,000 years, Zoroastrianism was a major religion in Iran. Later, some Zoroastrians migrated from Iran and settled down in the coastal towns of Gujarat and Maharashtra. They were the ancestors of today's Parsis. Imagine you want to go to listen to one of the preachers who lived about 2,500 years ago. Describe your conversation with your parents as you try to persuade them to let you go. Some important dates. Upanishad thinkers, the Jaina teacher Mahavira and the Buddha, about 2,500 years ago. Writing down of the Jaina texts, about 1,500 years ago. The story of Kisagatami. Here is a famous story about the Buddha. Once there was a woman named Kisagatami, whose son had died. She was so sad that she roamed through the streets of the city carrying the child with her, asking for help to bring him back to life. A kind man took her to the Buddha. The Buddha said, "Bring me a handful of mustard seeds, and I will bring your child back to life." Kisagatami was overjoyed and started off at once, but the Buddha gently stopped her and added, "The seeds must come from the house of a family where nobody has died." Kisagatami went from door to door, but wherever she went, she found out that someone or the other, father, mother, sister, brother, husband, wife, child, uncle, aunt, grandfather, grandmother had died. What was the Buddha trying to teach the sorrowing mother? The wise beggar. Here is a dialogue based on a story from one of the most famous Upanishads, the Chandogya Upanishad. Shaunaka and Abhiprataran were two sages who worshipped the universal soul. Once, as they sat down to eat, a beggar came and asked for some food. "We cannot spare anything for you," Shaunaka said. "Learned sirs, whom do you worship?" the beggar asked. The universal soul, Abhiprataran replied. Ah! It means that you know that the universal soul fills the entire world. Yes, yes. We know that. The sages nodded. If the universal soul fills the whole world, it fills me too. Who am I, but a part of the world? The beggar asked. You speak the truth, O young Brahmin. Then, O sages, by not giving me food, you are actually denying food to the universal soul. The sages realized the truth of what the beggar said, and shared their food with him. How did the beggar convince the sages to share their food with him? Panini, the grammarian. This was also the time when other scholars were at work. One of the most famous was Panini, who prepared a grammar for Sanskrit. He arranged the vowels and the consonants in a special order, and then used these to create formulae like those found in algebra. He used these to write down the rules of the language in short formulae, around 3,000 of them. A Buddhist text tells us, just as the waters of rivers lose their names and separateness when they flow into the mighty ocean, so are varna and ranks and family forgotten when the followers of the Buddha join the order of monks. The system of ashramas. Around the time when Jainism and Buddhism were becoming popular, Brahmins developed the system of ashramas. Here, the word ashrama does not mean a place where people live and meditate. It is used instead for a stage of life. 4 ashramas were recognized: Brahmacharya, Grihastha, Vanaprastha, and Samnyasa. Brahmin, Kshatriya, and Vaishya men were expected to lead simple lives and study the Vedas during the early years of their life, Brahmacharya. Then they had to marry and live as householders, Grihastha. Then they had to live in the forest and meditate, Vanaprastha. Finally, they had to give up everything and become Samnyasins. The system of ashramas allowed men to spend some part of their lives in meditation. Generally, women were not allowed to study the Vedas, and they had to follow the ashramas chosen by their husbands. In what way was the system of ashramas different from life in the Sangha? What are the varnas mentioned here? Were all 4 varnas allowed to participate in the system of ashramas? Chapter 8. Ashoka, the emperor who gave up war. Rojan's rupees. Rojan clutched the crisp notes that her grandfather had given her on her birthday. While she badly wanted to buy a new cassette, she also wanted to just see and feel the brand new notes. It was then that she noticed that all of them had a smiling face of Gandhiji printed on the right, and a tiny set of lions on the left. What were the lions there for, she wondered. A very big kingdom equals an empire. The lions that we see on our notes and coins have a long history. They were carved in stone, and placed on top of a massive stone pillar at Sarnath. Ashoka was one of the greatest rulers known to history, and on his instructions, inscriptions were carved on pillars, as well as on rock surfaces. Before we find out what was written in these inscriptions, let us see why his kingdom was called an empire. The empire that Ashoka ruled was founded by his grandfather, Chandragupta Maurya, more than 2,300 years ago. Chandragupta was supported by a wise man named Chanakya, or Kautilya. Many of Chanakya's ideas were written down in Arthashastra, a book called the. There were several cities in the empire. These included the capital Pataliputra, Taxila, and Ujjain. Taxila was a gateway to the northwest, including Central Asia, while Ujjain lay on the route from North to South India. Merchants, officials, probably lived in these cities, and craftspersons. In other areas there were villages of farmers and herders. In some areas such as central India, there were forests where people gathered forest produce and hunted animals for food. People in different parts of the empire spoke different languages. They probably ate different kinds of food, and wore different kinds of clothes as well. How are empires different from kingdoms? Emperors need more resources than kings because empires are larger than kingdoms, and need to be protected by big armies. So also they need a larger number of officials who collect taxes. Ruling the empire. As the empire was so large, different parts were ruled differently. The area around Pataliputra was under the direct control of the emperor. This meant that officials were appointed to collect taxes from farmers, herders, craftspersons, and traders, who lived in villages and towns in the area. Officials also punished those who disobeyed the ruler's orders. Many of these officials were given salaries. Messengers went to and fro, and spies kept a watch on the officials. And of course the emperor supervised them all, with the help of members of the royal family, and senior ministers. There were other areas or provinces. Each of these was ruled from a provincial capital such as Taxila or Ujjain. Although there was some amount of control from Pataliputra, and royal princes were often sent as governors, local customs and rules were probably followed. Besides, there were vast areas between these centers. Here the Mauryas tried to control roads and rivers, which were important for transport, and to collect whatever resources were available as tax and tribute. For example, the Arthashastra tells us that the northwest was important for blankets, and South India for its gold and precious stones. It is possible that these resources were collected as tribute. There were also the forested regions. People living in these areas were more or less independent, but may have been expected to provide elephants, timber, honey, and wax to Mauryan officials. Ashoka, a unique ruler. The most famous Mauryan ruler was Ashoka. He was the first ruler who tried to take his message to the people through inscriptions. Most of Ashoka's inscriptions were in Prakrit and were written in the Brahmi script. Ashoka's war in Kalinga. Kalinga is the ancient name of coastal Orissa. Ashoka fought a war to conquer Kalinga. However, he was so horrified when he saw the violence and bloodshed that he decided not to fight any more wars. He is the only king in the history of the world who gave up conquest after winning a war. Ashoka's inscription describing the Kalinga War. This is what Ashoka declared in one of his inscriptions: 8 years after becoming king I conquered Kalinga. About 1.5 lakh people were captured. And more than 1 lakh of people were killed. This filled me with sorrow. Why? Whenever an independent land is conquered, lakhs of people die, and many are taken prisoner. Brahmins and monks also die. People who are kind to their relatives and friends, to their slaves and servants die, or lose their loved ones. That is why I am sad, and have decided to observe Dhamma, and to teach others about it as well. I believe that winning people over through Dhamma is much better than conquering them through force. I am inscribing this message for the future, so that my son and grandson after me should not think about war. Instead, they should try to think about how to spread Dhamma. How did the Kalinga War bring about a change in Ashoka's attitude towards war? Dhamma is the Prakrit word for the Sanskrit term dharma. What was Ashoka's Dhamma? Ashoka's Dhamma did not involve worship of a god, or performance of a sacrifice. He felt that just as a father tries to teach his children, he had a duty to instruct his subjects. He was also inspired by the teachings of the Buddha. There were a number of problems that troubled him. People in the empire followed different religions, and this sometimes led to conflict. Animals were sacrificed. Slaves and servants were ill-treated. Besides, there were quarrels in families and amongst neighbors. Ashoka felt it was his duty to solve these problems. So, he appointed officials, known as the Dhamma Mahamata, who went from place to place teaching people about Dhamma. Besides, Ashoka got his messages inscribed on rocks and pillars, instructing his officials to read his message to those who could not read it themselves. Ashoka also sent messengers to spread ideas about Dhamma to other lands, such as Syria, Egypt, Greece, and Sri Lanka. He built roads, dug wells, and built rest houses. Besides, he arranged for medical treatment for both human beings and animals. Elsewhere, somewhat before the time of the Mauryan Empire, about 2,400 years ago, emperors in China began building the Great Wall. It was meant to protect the northern frontier of the empire from pastoral people. Additions to the wall were made over a period of 2,000 years because the frontiers of the empire kept shifting. The wall is about 6,400 kilometers long, and is made of stone and brick, with a road along the top. Several thousand people worked to build the wall. There are watchtowers all along, at distances of about 100,200 m. In what ways do you think Ashoka's attitude toward neighboring peoples was